Okay, a couple of things I want to address before I get, I guess, too deep into this video. One, I am not at all good at reading scripts, or at least trying to make it look like I'm maintaining eye contact with the camera while reading a script. I've tried multiple times before recording this. It didn't work. So in some parts, it's gonna look blatantly obvious that I'm just reading off of a script on the screen. So just go with it. I'll try to get better at that like as time progresses. Number two, this video altogether has taken a while for me to be able to finally get to the stage at which I can record everything because oh my god, researching some of these Reichskommissariats was a pain in my ass. Three, uh, I am well aware that that this is a World War One Pickelhaube, and that World War Two they didn't necessarily have those, but it's the closest I could find. And I guess, uh, other than that, I hope you enjoy the first general video that I've tried to pre-plan, like script, record, edit, the whole 9 yards. I guess, uh, just I don't know. uh, yeah. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to what has pretty much become the one fucking biannual video on this channel, with even biannual feeling like a bit of a stretch if you ask me. Yes, I want to post more videos on here, like on YouTube, but I can't really find anything of note to upload that aren't just like my streaming VODs. I am semi-regularly streaming on Twitch now, link in the description. Okay, unashamed plug over, onto what I actually want to discuss today. Nazis. Because why not, right? More specifically, the puppet regimes they set up during World War II, known as the Reichskommissariats. I love learning about history with World War II, well, with the World Wars in general, mostly World War II being by far my favorite era to learn about in history. I never hear from a lot of people, even some other history nerds like myself, about the Reichskommissariats. With a lot of my friends that I even know that well, they ever existed in the first place. So I wanted to try to use the scarce amount of information that I could find and teach you about them. Keyword is scarce. For some of these, there's not a lot, since the Nazi regimes as a whole seem to go very unnoticed in my opinion. Considering that there's not a whole lot of information for some of these, I wouldn't be surprised if some of what I'm saying is incorrect to an extent. So if you catch something that I got wrong, or if you happen to know something that I left out entirely, feel free to share in the comments. I'm going to try to do these in chronological order of establishment. I'm also going to attempt to add some probably dark humor and jokes here and there. This is the first video in which I've properly planned out beforehand, meaning I've created a proper script and theme for it instead of just incoherent rambling for 20 minutes, which is probably what this is going to end up becoming, I'm not going to lie. There may be few and far between. For the layout of each segment, I wanted to have something like this. Brief rundown of the commissariat in particular, how the commissariat was run, and at the bottom about how significant that specific commissariat was to Germany as a whole, and just what kind of, I guess, important roles it had for not only Germany, but for the war in its entirety. To start us off, lore time. Adolf Hitler, or as I call him, the wicked mustache man of the West, started the Second World War for a number of reasons, one of the primary ones being Lebensraum, or living space in English. Basically, Hitler wanted to unite all ethnic Germans and other Aryan peoples under one single banner, that of his Greater German Reich. Side note, the actual historical Aryan peoples are mostly situated in India and the Middle East, and had practically no relation to Western Europe apart from maybe some trading. His first target was that of Austria, a German-speaking nation bordering Germany to the south. It was unified with Germany itself in March of 1938, what was called the Anschluss, or unification. Upon this major feat, Hitler occupied the Sudetenland, an area in what was then Czechoslovakia, along the German border, that was largely occupied by Czech Germans, due to the Munich Conference a few months later in September. In March of 1939, just 2 days after the one-year anniversary of the Anschluss, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, something that he swore not to do in the Munich Conference, partitioning some lands with Hungary, specifically the southern area of what is now today Slovakia, as well as Carpatho-Ruthenia, which is part of Ukraine. In the spot of Czechoslovakia sat two new nations, one semi-independent, and one that was practically just an extension of Germany in all but name. These were the Slovak Republic, not to be confused with the Slovak Republic, and the Protectorate Böhmen und Mähren, the first non-annexed subjects of both Hitler and this video. We'll start out with the Slovak Republic. Created on March 14th as the Slovak state, Slovakia wasn't necessarily a commissariat as much as it was just a client state with large German influence and oversight. Former Slovak Prime Minister, while under Czechoslovakia, Josef Tiso, was the leader of the nation, and he would remain in power from its establishment until its capitulation to the Red Army in 1945, because I guess communism only works when its followers are dying in active combat or civil war. The Slovaks declared independence from Czechoslovakia on March 14th. Hitler's invasion/occupation of the rest of the area began the next day partially as a response to Slovak independence. Their capital was the city of Bratislava, which remains today as the capital city of modern-day Slovakia. During the war, Tiso's government supplied the Reich with equipment, resources, manpower, and sent tens of thousands of Slovakian Jews to be imprisoned and or executed in Germany, being the first Nazi-aligned nation to willingly deport their Jewish population to Germany starting in 1942. The Slovak army also trained a good chunk of their forces in Germany and fought alongside them throughout Unternehmen Barbarossa, or Operation Barbarossa, notably playing roles in the battles of Lipovek and Rostov. In 1944, Slovakia suffered an anti-Axis uprising that saw 9,500 Axis casualties and 12,000 partisan casualties. It was originally planned to be in 1943, but it ended up getting delayed until the next year. Slovakia capitulated on April 4th, 1945, after the Soviets occupied Bratislava. Josip Tiso was hanged on April 18th, 1947, for his collaboration with the Nazis. Slovakia, under a German sphere of influence, was run slightly differently than you would expect a Nazi client to normally run, because Nazis. Since the nation was seen as and mostly treated as independent by Berlin as well as Rome, it was able to hold a large degree of autonomy from Germany. It held its own Slovak army that mostly wasn't controlled by the Reich. It had its own governmental system, as opposed to the other Reichskommissariats that Berlin created. Berlin and Bratislava signed a protection treaty on March 23rd, 1939, that gave Berlin partial control over the Slovak foreign, military, and economic sectors. This treaty was the beginning of Slovakia as a partial subject of Germany. The Wehrmacht also created a protection zone along the border with the Protectorate Böhmen-Udmärten in August, giving them absolute control in the area. It was also used as a staging ground for the Wehrmacht to invade Poland to the north from Slovakia just 3 days later on September 1st. Slovakia was also used as a staging ground for Barbarossa, the German invasion of the USSR. Notice that in the background. Fucking communist flag that Undead got me for Christmas. The Slovak army itself also participated in the invasion. Slovakia didn't join on the Western Front, however, until 1942, when Tiso declared war on the UK and the USA. Think of it like a Hitler move. He totally didn't necessarily have to, but like he did anyway. The Slovak Expeditionary Army Group, as it was called, was a branch of the Slovak army that was placed under German command during Barbarossa. Its 45,000 men entered the Soviet Union shortly after the invasion had begun, but it was riddled with transportation and logistical problems. So a few thousand members, known today as the Pilfelsek Brigade, good luck, were chosen to head to the front lines, fighting alongside the German 17th Army during the battles of Uman and Lipovek in July. The SEAG, or for funnier terms, the SEAG, was reorganized into 2 infantry divisions in August, with the new Slovak 1st Division being sent to the front until being destroyed at the Kuban bridgehead and the Battle of Melitopol, while the Slovak 2nd Division was kept behind to security in the occupied lands. Back within the Slovak borders, the nation became the first of Germany's allies to adopt a series of anti-Semitic laws similar to the Nuremberg laws of Germany starting in September of 1941. They also became the first Nazi ally to deport the Jewish population toward the German concentration camps, with Slovakia removing approximately 70,000 Jews from their homes and sending them towards the Reich, where most of them, about 65,000 of which, would die in the Holocaust. Slovakia was important to Berlin for a couple key reasons, one of which being that Hitler did not only invade Czechoslovakia due to Slovakia coincidentally declaring independence. Hitler had basically forced the Slovak government to declare independence from Czechoslovakia with the promise that, had they chosen not to do so, they would also be invaded. It was also a very strategic location for Germany, with its northern border being shared with Poland. It allowed Hitler to invade Poland from 3 directions: north, west, and south. It also expanded the Nazi sphere of influence closer to the Balkan states, like Hungary and Romania. Now that you can, I guess, get a basic idea of the structuring, the whole premise of what exactly this video is, hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier to understand what exactly it is that I'm fucking talking about. Anyway, now that Slovakia is out of the way, now we're getting into the first proper Reichskommissariat, the Protectorate Böhmen-Udmärten. Established after the completion of the German invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Protectorate Böhmen-Udmärten, or the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, was, as mentioned earlier, more or less a new chunk of Germany itself in all but name. The reasoning for separating the Czech half of Czechoslovakia from the Slovak half was mostly due to the Slovak Declaration of Independence, coincidentally, meaning Germany assisted them in reaching independence from Czechoslovakia. However, there was also another factor. The Czechs, having been under the rule of the Austrian then Austro-Hungarian empires, were still seen by Hitler as Untermensch, or undesirables in Nazi eyes, but the Czechs specifically were viewed as a distant form of Germans who, after much Germanification, could be reintroduced to Greater Germany. As a result, the area was much more integrated with Germany than Slovakia. Hitler appointed German Reichsminister of Foreign Affairs Konstantin von Neurath as Reichsprotector of the region until he was deemed too lenient, and the director of the Reich Security Main Office, Reinhard Heydrich, became the deputy protector until his death in 1942, during which time von Neurath still held the title of Reichsprotector, but in reality Heydrich held most of the actual authority. In 1943, von Neurath was replaced as Reichsprotector by Reichsminister of the Interior Wilhelm Frick, who was in charge of the protectorate, was dissolved after the German surrender in May of 1945. Reichsprotector von Neurath was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials and given 15 years in prison. He was released after the Paris Conference in 1954 due to ill health and died in 1956. Another purpose the Germans had for Czechia was to use their gold reserves to hold the German rearmament program that had been in place since the Nazis rose to power in 1933. The cost of the program was becoming close to unsustainable for the German economy, which was still recovering from the Great Depression, as was pretty much everyone else. So the use of Austrian gold acquired from the Anschluss and Czech gold acquired from the invasion of Czechoslovakia drastically helped to reduce the economical burden. All this talk is going to be the death of me. The protectorate's Bochum und Mähren was deemed a protectorate by Germany, but in reality it held extremely little international recognition, let alone reputation, being seen more so as a direct piece of Germany rather than a pseudo-independent state. As a result, the Reich was free to do more or less whatever they wanted with it. The Czech manufacturer Skoda, I hope I pronounced that right,
Škoda.
was hijacked to manufacture weapons, support equipment, and vehicles for the Wehrmacht as opposed to commercial automobiles that it normally made. The Protectorate had no military forces of its own, possibly so the population wouldn't risk fighting back against the occupation, so all citizens in the region who wished to join the military joined the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, etc. The Protectorate also had major German oversight in the education sector, with all teachers required to be fluent speakers of German and degree all students with the classic Nazi salute and the infamous phrase Sieg Heil. All the members of the exam boards were required to be ethnic Germans, and the German inspectors would regularly enter classrooms unannounced to make sure the teachers met all teaching requirements and that the Reich's pro-German teachings were being followed. But this didn't stop some teachers from sneaking in practices that were not allowed, such as speaking Czech with the students when no inspectors were present and refusing to use Sieg Heil and grading the students. When someone was discovered to be using these anti-German practices, they would either be imprisoned or executed if the offense was deemed bad enough. In fact, just the first half of 1944 alone, over 1,000 Czech teachers have been imprisoned or executed, and by 1945, the total number of teachers sent to concentration camps exceeded 5,000. With at least 1,000 dying in the process. At the end of the war, approximately 60% of teachers in the capital city of Prague alone were fired, with the average in the country as a whole reaching around 40%. The Protectorate Bochum und Mähren was important to Berlin for its industry as well as its gold reserves. Before occupation, Czechoslovakia was already making a large part of the equipment used by the German military, so by occupying it, the Germans could use the remaining factories as well. Berlin also wanted the Czechoslovak gold to keep the German economy running with its large expenses on the military and domestic industries. Now that the pre-war pilots have been taken care of to the best of my ability, time for the first of many Reichskommissariats that were established during the war itself, the General Government. This is going to be good. Formally created on October 26, 1939, I swear to God this is the full name, I'm probably going to butcher it, the General Government for die Besitzen Polnischen Gebiete, or the General Government for the occupied Polish region. Why is the German language so easy yet so hard to understand? Was meant to govern and administer the occupied lands of central Poland. In 1941, soon after Barbarossa kicked off, the General Government was expanded to encompass southeastern Poland and was now western Ukraine. The name was later shortened to just General Government in July 1940, probably due to everyone getting a fucking brain aneurysm trying to pronounce this bullshit. Hitler appointed the Reichsminister without portfolio Hans Frank as Governor General of the area. Its capital was designated as the city of Krakow in southern Poland, partially due to Warsaw being mostly destroyed. The General Government lasted from its establishment until January 29, 1945, 2 days after the Red Army liberated Warsaw from the Germans. Governor General Frank was convicted of crimes against humanity at Nuremberg and hanged on October 16, 1946. This Reichskommissariat in particular is almost always ignored on historical maps, instead either being shoved in with the rest of Nazi-occupied Poland or being shown as de facto annexed part of Germany without its own designated borders. The General Government was an exceptionally harsh region of Nazi occupation. Hitler already disliked anyone who was not ethnically German or a distant relative of German, but he despised Slavs most of all. And with Poland being a Slavic nation, meaning the majority of its population were ethnic Slavs, they received many of the worst aspects of life under Nazi rule. A large portion of Poles in the area were also Jews, like I said. so they had it tremendously worse. The Nazis established many ghettos in the larger Polish cities, such as the infamous Warsaw Ghetto, as well as other lesser-known ghettos like Krakow and Tarnopol, where hundreds of thousands of Jews and even a large amount of non-Jews were imprisoned before the final solution was enacted in 1942. There was no domestic military or defense force, meaning all defense and most police work was enforced by the Wehrmacht's military police and the SS units in the area. It is unknown exactly how many soldiers were stationed in the area, but it was at least in the tens of thousands. The education sector of the region was also almost non-existent. All universities were disbanded, and most teachers and professors were persecuted. This was done because the Nazis believed that the Slavic Poles were not deserving of any kind of education higher than what is in the US the 4th grade. Because Berlin was planning to revert the population to a form of serfdom over time, similar to that of the late Russian Empire. The majority of proper education was done in secrecy by the underground Polish resistance, which, side note, if you would like me to possibly make a video entirely over the Polish resistance as well as other forms of paramilitary resistance groups, let me know in the comments, because that is another point of World War II that I love. And the Polish resistance especially is by far my favorite for a multitude of reasons. But that is to be reserved for the hypothetical but possibly future video on them. Getting back on topic, schools in the Polish territories annexed directly into Germany, and a lot of schools in the general government were banned from teaching in the Polish language altogether, with the Reich wishing to prepare the area for heavy German migration. Hitler had a plan that, over the next 2 decades, the majority of the Polish population in the general government was to be replaced by ethnic Germans. Polish cultures and historical pieces were also lost, with hundreds of museums being ransacked and over 40,000 Polish paintings being stolen, including many famous works like Portrait of a Young Man by Raphael. The general government was the primary hotspot of the Holocaust, with a great deal of Nazi concentration camps and every designated death camp located there, with camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka being the most notable. It is here that in these 2 camps alone, over 2 million Jews were murdered, which amounts to approximately 1/3 of all documented Jewish deaths in the Holocaust. The region was also another prime location for Lebensraum, with the area being fairly resourceful, close proximity to Germany, and in an area that could be defended decently well, considering that both Germany and Poland lay on the great European plain with most of the Reich's continental enemies. All in all, the general government was wanted for a number of reasons, and after Lebensraum had taken shape in the region, was intended to be incorporated into Germany itself. But due to the Germans, losing, it fortunately didn't turn out that way. Well, it kind of did in the sense that Poland was completely independent after the war, since the angry mustache man of the East wanted it now. So it's been about 2.5 months since that last recording. Yeah. And, you may notice, one, my fit is a little bit different. I'm well aware that this is World War I attire instead of World War II, and I know that this doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Just in general, this is a Nordic Viking cloak that I bought, except in my defense, I feel like me and my friends feel like this fits the aesthetic. Too, you may have noticed the boy. This charming little fellow I have appropriately dubbed the Platte Kaiser. I also know that the Kaiser is World War I era and before, and we're talking about World War II. I don't care. He's cute. He's goofy. I love it. He's German. We're talking about Germany. So as far as I'm concerned, he's gonna be big chillin' for the rest of this. Now, where was I? We discussed the general government last time, at least last I remember. So now we're moving on. But moving away from mainland Europe for a bit, we are heading north into Denmark. The German invasion of Denmark in and of itself was very unique. It was part of Unternehmen Weserübung, along with the invasion of Norway. From the first boots on the ground to the Danish surrender took only 6 out, and there were very few casualties on either side. Overall, the invasion is definitely deserving of its own video. The German Protectorate of Denmark was created in the early morning of April 9th, 1940, only a couple hours after the surrender of Denmark. It lasted until August 29th, 1943, when the area was brought under direct control of the Wehrmacht. Before the direct occupation, the Germans appointed Cecil von Rentfink to oversee the general function of things, and upon direct military oversight, he was replaced by SS Obergruppenführer Werner Best. During the time of being under protectorate status, the Danish lands and people were surprisingly left alone for the most part. I'll talk a bit more about that in the next segment. Plenipotentiary Best testified as a witness at Nuremberg and was sentenced to death by a Danish court in 1948, but his sentence was reduced to 12 years on appeal. He was sent back to West Germany in 1951 in an amnesty program between the two nations for Nazi war criminals. He died in Germany in 1989. Best, specifically, he had a pretty interesting life after the war was over. So if you feel like I should make a video just about him as a whole, since I don't really know all that much about him, I know barely anything about him as a matter of fact, then let me know, and I will look into it and see what all I can find on this dude. When I say that Denmark was left alone, I mean the Germans barely interfered with their government or their policies. The Danish government still held democratic policies, and the Nazis even allowed Danes to hold a democratic election in 1942, hoping for a pro-Nazi fascist party to be elected. That was similar to Vidkun Quisling's collaborationist party in Norway. That will be discussed in further detail when we get to the Reichskommissariat Norwegen. Unfortunately for Germany in the short term and Denmark in the long term, a separate party was elected, one that was not as friendly to Berlin. The next year, Germany placed Denmark under direct military control. As for other aspects of the Danish political system during the war, the Germans were lenient enough to even allow the Danish king Christian X to remain the reigning monarch and head of state. During the military occupation, Christian X was placed under indefinite house arrest and imprisoned in the Danish royal palace. The Danish judicial system was also left intact. There were no Nazi-appointed judges or attorneys. Everything was still more or less run by the Danes, with some more minor exceptions, at least at the very beginning. The Danish education sector was left unbothered before military control. Danish was still taught in schools, the students were still taught pro-Denmark subjects, there were no sudden Nazi officer pop-ins, etc. Same with the Danish press, still being allowed to report on more or less anything they wanted. Even the Jewish population wasn't messed with, a move which gave the Danish government enough time to allow almost the entirety of the Danish Jews to evacuate to neutral Sweden before Berlin squeezed its grip on the region. Denmark was mostly used by Germany as a launch point for the amphibious invasion of Norway. The Nazis also used the Jutland Peninsula to secure the mouth of the Baltic Sea to prevent any allied fleets from entering or leaving the waters. As you probably noticed, Denmark specifically didn't necessarily have a whole lot of information with it. That doesn't mean that I didn't research deep enough. I researched as deep as I could, and as much as I could. Except, again, like I said at the beginning of the video, a lot of these are fucking hard to find. Not only with specifically Denmark, just pretty much the whole video throughout its entirety. I'm not adding in every individual piece of information that I found for each of these. More so just enough to give a brief, basic example of what each thing was, what each commissariat was, how it was run, and why it existed in the first place. Because had I gone for every single thing, even though all in all there's not necessarily an insanely big amount to go off of, had I put everything that I found, we would probably be here for a while, at least a couple hours or so. Anyway, back on topic. We are remaining in Scandinavia for the next commissariat, because we're heading into Norway. The Kingdom of Norway was the other country invaded during Utenhetsrevolution alongside Denmark, and like Denmark, had fairly tame occupation rules and demands. Again, at least in the beginning. The invasion began on April 9th, 1940, and lasted until the major skirmishes finally subsided on June 10th. The Reichskommissariat Norwegen was established on April 24th, with the Gauleiter of Gau-Essen, Josef Terboven, being appointed by Hitler to be the Reichskommissar. He was actually not the only major leader of the region for the first few months, with the internationally illegitimate government being controlled by the fascist Nationalsamling Party, led by Vidkun Quisling. He remained the unofficial Prime Minister of Norway until September 25th, when Terboven replaced the entire cabinet with Germans and Norwegian collaborators, and while the NS was technically the active party in the occupied region on paper, the NSDAP was actually in charge. The official Norwegian government was returned on May 7th, 1945, after Germany surrendered to the Allies. Quisling, as well as other collaborators, were tried in Nuremberg, and most were executed in the following months. Terboven, after being removed as Reichskommissar by Karl Dönitz on May 7th, committed suicide on May 8th by blowing himself up in a bunker in Norway. You know, if I had a nickel for every Nazi head of state that committed suicide in a bunker, I'd only have 2 nickels, but it's weird that it happened twice. Life in the Reichskommissariat Norwegen was decently well off compared to the other Nazi puppets, but that in no way means it was the exact same as before the occupation. For instance, as per usual after a nation, ceases to exist due to warfare, the Norwegian economy was heavily damaged, not only due to the war itself, but the occupation as well, since the Nazis robbed the nation of nearly 60% of its industrial output by the end of the war. Norway also lost all of its primary trading partners during the occupation, now needing to rely solely on Germany and its fascist allies. Like, we're talking Germany, Italy, Hungary, Romania, all of them. As a result, many people starved, dehydrated, and even froze to death. The majority of the primarily demanded goods were acquired via the black market, as well as ersatz goods, or inferior items used to replace another item that is currently unavailable. Minister Quisling did not wish for the Nazis to remain in Norway for an extended period of time. While he was the minister-president on paper, Reichskommissar Josef Terboven was that one that actually was in charge, and he refused to answer the Quisling, but instead he would only follow orders given to him directly by Hitler. Quisling requested to Hitler on multiple occasions that Terhoven be removed and recalled to Germany, but his requests were denied every time. The government was obviously highly influenced by Berlin and the German occupiers, but that doesn't mean the Norwegian collaborators didn't have their own wishes for the region. Quisling, for example, asked for territorial claims resembling the era of Norwegian history when the nation was called Norgesveldi. I'm gonna assume that's right. With territorial claims over northern Lapland owned by Finland and Sweden, and the Kola Peninsula owned by the USSR. Quisling proposed to both the OKW and Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, of an invasion into Sweden using the German Lapland army stationed in northern Finland before and during Unternehmen Barbarossa, but this attack did not proceed. On top of mainland claims, Quisling also wished for annexation of the Faroe Islands, Iceland, the Orkney Islands, Shetland Island, the Outer Hebrides, Franz Josef Land, and Greenland. The Germans wanted Norway for numerous strategic reasons. For one, the Reich wished to use the Norwegian naval bases along the North Sea to send ships in the North Atlantic to have an advantage over the Royal Navy in the area. The Germans also wished to guarantee a steady flow of iron ore to Germany, and to keep that iron ore from making it to Britain or France beforehand. Probably the most well-known cause for the invasion, however, was to capture the Vimork hydroelectric plant at Telemark. The Nazis required the supplies of Norwegian heavy water produced at the plant for their nuclear weapons project, which didn't necessarily come to fruition. It's May 10th, 1940, and the Germans have begun a move that the Allies were unprepared for. France had stationed the majority of their soldiers along the Maginot Line, because there was surely no way that the German Panzer fleet could get through the Ardennes forests in northern France and the Benelux, right? Right? Oh, they did? Well, shit. The Netherlands, being in the German line of fire, was invaded along with the rest of the Benelux on May 10th, and the Netherlands specifically lasted only 5 days before surrendering once the Luftwaffe bombed Rotterdam. On the 29th, the Reichskommissariat Nederlande was created after the military leadership in the region was replaced by a civilian-led one, with the role of Reichskommissariat given to Arthur Seyss-Inquart, formerly the final chancellor of Austria before it was Anschluss into Germany proper in 1938. The Dutch people were considered racially related to Hitler by his Aryans, so he believed that he needed to win over the population towards National Socialism and Nazism, with the intent of fully integrating the Netherlands into Germany proper after the war was over. Something that, while small groups aligned with, the majority of the population obviously didn't care for their oppressors and anti-Semitic occupiers. I wouldn't either, but that's just me. The workers would commonly hold strikes and boycotts across the nation, with the best example being the February strike, held primarily by the Communist Party of the Netherlands. It was used as an active defense for the Dutch Jews and against the anti-Jewish laws that had been put in place by the Nazis. The 3-day strike had some very short-term effects, with Dutch production being temporarily reduced and some transportation routes and even schools being shut down. But the strike was eventually suppressed, and the Jewish neighborhoods in Amsterdam were turned into a ghetto. The Reichskommissariat Nederlande would cease to exist on May 5th, 1945, after being liberated by the Canadian Armed Forces, and the Reichskommissar Seyss-Inquart would later be sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials, and subsequently hanged in October. Much like other Reichskommissariats, the governmental system in the Reichskommissariat Nederlande was full mostly of Nazi officials and Dutch collaborators, and as well as members of the National Socialistische Beweging, or the NSB, being the primary fascist-leaning political party in the Netherlands at the time. The head of state was the Reichskommissar Seyss-Inquart, and his General Commissare, or General Commissars, which were basically his cabinet members. Under them were the rest of the Nazi collaborators. Seyss-Inquart and his Generalkommissar für das Sicherheitswesen, or General Commissar for Security, Hans Albin Rauter, would often butt heads over a number of reasons. Partially due to Rauter, due to having the role of higher SS and police leader, took orders from Himmler rather than Seyss-Inquart. These conflicts between the two became more prevalent after the February strike, when they began to rival each other over how to manage Jewish affairs, where Rauter had overall more authority than Seyss-Inquart. The Netherlands is also where the former German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had been living in exile since 1919. He was given a 24/7 security force that would guard his house up until his death in June 1941. He was given a small military funeral that was attended by a few hundred Moors, including Seyss-Inquart, World War I Animal Wilhelm Canary, and one of the most famous German generals of World War I, and contender for the swaggest mustache I have ever seen, August von Mackensen, who donned his imperial uniform for the funeral. Kaiser Wilhelm II was buried at his Dutch home in Huidorn with his will stating that until the German monarchy is restored, the royal's body is to never return to Germany. So, 80 plus years later after his death, Kaiser Wilhelm II is still entombed at his Dutch home at Huidorn. Seyss-Inquart wished to lure the Dutch people into National Socialism over time, as Berlin wished to integrate the Netherlands into Germany proper after a German victory in the war. He faced two main setbacks, however. For one, the majority of the Dutch population wouldn't want their nation to be brought into Germany because, speaking as an American here, independence is pretty cool. The other problem was the NSB. The Dutch fascists were already extremely disliked by the general populace before the war, let alone during occupation. Call it a hunch, but I think that being a member of an unpopular political party in a country that gets attacked by another country that agrees with your party may not do much good for you. Because of these reasons, the NSB was given only limited power and positions, while the more important roles were given to German officials. The Netherlands was in a very strategic position to Germany, with the nation being situated along the northern mainland coast of the English Channel. The Luftwaffe could use the Dutch airfields as launching grounds for their bombers during the London Blitz and fighters for the Battle of Britain in an attempt to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. On the other hand, the Netherlands was also used as a staging area for the Nazis to blitzkrieg their way through Belgium and into northern France. Dutch ports were used for both trade into the Reich and as spaces to launch German U-boats into and out of the channel to attack Allied ships in the area. After the fall of France, the Germans, and now the Italians, who had joined the war in June 1940, began to look towards influencing the Balkan states in southern Europe. The Italians had annexed Albania in 1939 and had declared war on Greece in October of 1940. At first, the Italians were actually repelled by Greek forces, with help from the British, pushed fairly deep into Albania. It wasn't until April 6th when Germany intervened on the side of Italy and invaded both Greece and Yugoslavia with the help of her new allies of Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. While there were no Reichskommissariats created in the occupied Greek lands, the same can't necessarily be said for Yugoslavia. The independent state of Croatia was not a Reichskommissariat necessarily, but it was a Nazi puppet state similar to Slovakia. Established on April 10th, 1941, the independent state of Croatia, or by Croatian is gonna be shit, Nezavisna Država Hrvatska in Croatian, was formed after the general Croatian population chose to cooperate with the Axis powers and no longer wanted to be under the thumb of primarily Serbian-ruled Yugoslavia. It consisted of modern-day Croatia, excluding portion of Dalmatia until late 1943, Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as small pieces of Serbia and Slovenia that had a large Croat population. It was headed by Poglavnik Ante Pavelić and became an Italian-headed monarchy on May 15th, when the laws of the crown in Zlovnimir were signed between Croatia and Italy, giving the throne to Italian Prince Aimone, who changed his title to King Tomislav II after the famed Croatian King Tomislav I. Upon the Italian Civil War beginning in 1943, Aimone abdicated the throne and annexed Italian Dalmatia with the exception of the city of Zara. The Croatian state was formally dissolved on May 8, 1945, and the Croatian armed forces surrendered on the 15th. Ante Pavelić fled to Austria and then snuck into Italy disguised as a Peruvian priest. He would then flee to Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1948, where he would reside until coming to Spain in 1957, shortly after an assassination attempt where he was shot in the back and collarbone by a former Montenegrin partisan. With a bullet lodged in his spine, Pavelić would die from complications on December 28, 1959 in Madrid. Croatia had an interesting system of management, so much so that even Hitler thought some of their methods were too much. But we'll get to that shortly. For one, a number of European nations actually came to recognize Croatia as a sovereign nation, including neutral but fascist alliance Spain. The capital city of Zagreb even housed foreign embassies from other Axis nations, Finland, and Japan, with consulates from Sweden, Switzerland, and Argentina, among others. Economy-wise, the Croatian state was mostly reliant on Germany and Italy, who agreed to help their Balkan ally if a series of demands were made, like the Germans getting resource rights in Croatia to fuel their own war effort, which soon became full resource rights over the entire country, being handed to Berlin in May 1941. This was obviously a major weight on the Croatian shoulders, as it basically banned them from using their own supplies for domestic reasons. Italy was also allowed to freely use Croatian lumber for its army, as well as receive monthly payments for Croatia and resupply the Italian division stationed within Croatian borders. Okay, time for the interesting stuff. The Croatian genocides. The Croatian branch of the Holocaust consisted mostly of Croatian and Bosnian Jews, Serbs, Roma, and many other people groups. As a matter of fact, the soldiers that were used for the killings had their own special types of knives that they dubbed Srbljak, which translates to Serb cutter. I don't know about you guys, but I have just a sneaking suspicion that Croatia held just a bit of a grudge. Pavelić said that anyone who does not support the fascist government was by default guilty of treason, and anyone caught committing anti-government acts was immediately put to death. The Croatian army even set up death squads in camps built specifically for children. Yeah, this got so bad that even some Nazi officials requested that the Croatians ease up on the killings. You heard that right. The Nazis, famous for murdering tens of millions of innocent people for completely retarded reasons, told the Croatians to stop killing their opposition as brutally as they were. Just let that sink in for a second. Okay, you done? I got work to do. The Croatian government was helpful to Berlin in a couple key ways. For one, the Reich didn't need to reserve as much manpower for the Balkan region since Croatia had its own standing military. They also assisted the Germans with ethnic cleansing in the region, as you have just figured out. With Croatia having a coastline along the Adriatic Sea, the Germans finally had direct access to the Mediterranean Sea instead of having to use Italian ports exclusively. For the next stop on our tour, we are leaving the Balkans and heading east. On June 22nd, 1941, approximately 4.2 million German and German allied soldiers rapidly began to move east into the Soviet Union in Utrem and Barbarossa, a sneak attack prompted by Germany after the fall of France. Put in charge of general handling of the eastern lands was the Reichsministerium für die besetzten Ostgebiete, or the Reichsministry for the occupied eastern territories, led by Reichsminister Alfred Rosenberg. Two of the first major regions that were hit in the Axis onslaught were the Belarusian SSR and the Baltic SSRs. In less than a month, the Belarusian, Lithuanian, and Latvian SSRs had either come under full occupation or majority occupation by the Germans. As a result, the Reichskommissariat Ostland was formally established on July 17, 1941, with Collector Heinrich Losch made the Reichskommissar of the region. The Reichskommissariat consisted at first of the Lithuanian, Latvian, and the majority of the Belarusian SSRs. The Estonian SSR was added in late December after the fall of Tallinn. The capital Riga was designated as the capital of the Reichskommissariat, possibly due to it being situated in the central Baltics, an area that Hitler proposed to mostly or fully incorporate into the Reich after the war. Belarusia especially sustained a tremendous form of damage during the fighting and occupation, in terms of both infrastructure and lives. A large chunk of factories and farmland were destroyed, and approximately 2 million people, about 1/4 of the population, died during the 4-year struggle. 800,000 of which were Belarusian Jews. Baltics, on the other hand, suffered more or less the same, but in a slightly different manner. As a matter of fact, due mostly to the illegal Soviet annexations of the Baltic nations a year earlier, a lot of the Baltic peoples actually welcomed and even fought alongside the German invaders. They'd hoped that Berlin would reestablish Baltic independence, but that was soon snuffed out once it became apparent that the Nazis were not leaving anytime soon. The region basically went from one occupying power to another, and it was all too apparent as the Germans did what they did everywhere else and exploited the land, resources, and people for themselves, as well as implement anti-Semitic laws and the Holocaust. I was unable to find an approximate number of Jewish deaths in the Baltics as a whole, but to put into perspective, Lithuania alone held around 220,000 Jews when the invasion began, give or take. By the end of the war, approximately 95% of them were dead. In the latter half of the war, when it was becoming clear the Axis were most likely going to lose, some Baltic communities rose up against the now returning Red Army a second time, with thousands of primarily Estonians either joining the Waffen SS or traveling to Finland to fight the Soviets in the north. So slay queen. Fucking hate everything I just did. In August 1944, Lodz fled the Reichskommissariat once the Red Army properly recaptured the majority of the region. He was replaced by Erich Koch, the Reichskommissar from the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, which capitulated the following month. All in all, Reichskommissariat Ostland would formally cease to exist on January 21st, 1945. Reichskommissar Heinrich Losch would be captured by British soldiers shortly after the German capitulation. He was tried at Bielefeld from October 1947 to January 1948 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released early for health reasons and died in 1964. Due to his lackluster leadership and cowardice later in the war, Lodz was widely disregarded by Rosenberg throughout the conflict. While I was unable to find a large amount of information on the Reichskommissariat Ostland's policies and systems, I can use what I can here. For starters, the majority Slavic population, mostly in Belarusia, was almost immediately targeted for forced labor, a lot of them being worked to death. The Ostland Jews, on the other hand, were confined to ghettos, with one of the more notable ones being in Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian SSR. Once the ghettos were to be liquidated, the majority of the Jews were killed by the Einsatzgruppen death squads and thrown into mass graves. The Einsatzgruppen would often go into the ghettos themselves and execute people left and right. Approximately 1,081,000 Ostland Jews were murdered, with 800,000 in Belarusia, 210,000 in Lithuania, 70,000 in Latvia, and 1,000 in Estonia. For context, Estonia's Jewish population was only around 4,500 in 1939, and by the time of Barbarossa, the majority had already fled. In 1942, Reichskommissar Lodz was ordered by Rosenberg to deport approximately 500,000 citizens to Germany to do forced labor to help the war, as well as domestic manpower shortages in factories. Some were just straight up sent to concentration camps upon arrival into Germany. Reichskommissariat Ostland was the primary testing bed for Generalplan Ost, or General Plan East, which was the tactics that the Reich wanted to use for the expansion and Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. It also served as a key supply region, with it being located on the border with occupied Poland and East Prussia. The Wehrmacht used its decently vast supply system to maintain a stable flow of resources to the front line. Staying in the east for this next subject, onto a place that has surged in importance, especially in the last decade for many reasons, including yet another dictator saying, "Give me," in case that one sentence was enough of a hint, we're going to Ukraine. Reichskommissariat Ukraine was formally established on August 20th, 1941, and the Reichskommissariat Koch officially took power on September 1st. It consisted of, well, Ukraine. But not all of Ukraine, however. Galicia was given to the general government, and large portions of eastern and northern Ukraine were mostly under military administration, with the intent of being added to the Reichskommissariat Moscovian, one of three Reichskommissariats which were either partially but never fully established, or never established at all. The Crimean Peninsula was set to be temporarily included in Ukraine, but later on annexed outright into the Reich itself, a move which never ended up happening. So the peninsula was put under military administration for the duration of its occupation. On top of all that, Reichskommissar Koch proposed for the regions of Stalino, Voronezh, Rostov, Saratov, Kuban, and even Stalingrad to be incorporated at later dates. But this was never acted upon, mostly due to Germany beginning to eat shit later in the war. The capital of the Reichskommissariat was not Kiev, as Hitler wished for the city to soon cease to exist. Instead, the administration was seated in the western city of Rovno, or Rivne as it is currently known. Regionally, similar to other Reichskommissariats, the more strategically important areas had a significantly higher level of oversight by the Wehrmacht. A lot of Ukrainians, similar to the Baltic peoples, welcomed the Axis invaders. Under pre-war Soviet rule, the Ukrainian SSR was overall not a very good place to live, especially when Premier Joseph Stalin was in charge. For example, the Ukrainian SSR was the primary site of the infamous Holodomor, a mass famine spanning from 1932 to 1933, which led to the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. This event, as well as many others, leads a large number of people, especially in former SSRs, to deem Stalin as a worse dictator than Hitler. But that's a topic for another video, and even if I even attempted to dive into that, it would probably take hours. As a result of the Ukrainian public holding a higher than normal regard for the Nazi occupiers, a lot of them volunteered in the ranks of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. However, not all the region felt the same way. Sabotaging and underground resistance movements were still very common, primarily within the Slavic and Jewish populations, due to the administration seemingly prioritizing removing them over other ethnicities. Reichskommissar Koch was probably the most brutal of the Reichskommissars appointed by Hitler. Originally proposed as Reichskommissar for Reichskommissariat Ostland, Koch turned it down. Later on, Heinrich Himmler proposed that Koch be appointed Reichskommissar for Ukraine, a position which he accepted. To put into perspective the mindset that Koch had, the following are two direct quotes of his. "If I meet a Ukrainian worthy of being seated at my table, I must have him shot. We are a master race, which must remember that the lowliest German worker is racially and biologically 1,000 times more valuable than the population here." One of Koch's first acts was to ban ethnic Ukrainians from getting schooling, deeming that Ukraine children need no schools. What they'll have to learn will be taught to them by their German masters. Koch assumed power over the Reichskommissariat Ostland on September 21st, 1944, after Heinrich Losch fled the region a month prior. Once it was becoming apparent that the Red Army's advance in the area was not ending anytime soon. He himself had retreated to East Prussia by the time the Ostland capital Riga was recaptured by the Soviets in October. On November 10th, 1944, Reichskommissariat Ukraine was formally dissolved. Reichskommissar Koch would go into hiding after the war. After failing to convince an U-boat crew to take him to South America, Koch was captured by the British in 1949. He was transferred to the Polish government, who would imprison him until 1958, when he was put on trial for crimes against the Polish people during the war, but not the Ukrainians. He was sentenced to death on March 9th, 1959, but was later commuted to life imprisonment. He was interviewed in his cell from 1986 about the history of Königsberg, where he led a Volkssturm battalion shortly before the city fell to the Soviets. He claimed that, had it been his decision, he would have never given up the city. Koch would die shortly after of natural causes in his prison cell at the age of 90, being the final World War II war criminal under Polish custody to do so. With Reichskommissariat Ukraine being under the grip of Erich Koch, life for everyone was exceptionally brutal. Hitler demanded that Koch be brutal in his efforts to govern the region, meaning he often undermined Rosenberg on many occasions, as he hoped for the Ukrainian people to view Germany as their liberator, whereas Hitler and Koch had other plans. Only days after members of a Ukrainian resistance group proclaimed Ukrainian statehood in July 1941, the instigators of this chain were sent to concentration camps, showing the overall Ukrainian populace that the Germans had no plans of freeing them from the oppression they endured during Soviet rule, if anything making it worse. The Ukrainian branch of the Holocaust, though prevalent, was not prioritized for the first few months of occupation until fall of 1941, when the Jewish genocides ramped up extremely, lasting until 1944, when the killings began to subside as Axis forces abandoned the region. As for the rest of Hitler's proposed Lebensraum strategies, all Ukrainians that were deemed as unfit for Germanization were to be expelled and sent beyond the Ural mountain range and into the vast Siberian tundras. However, Berlin's attempts to actually convince the German population to move the Reichskommissariat Ukraine bore little fruit, as only a few villages were fully cleared of Ukrainians, while very few Germans moved eastward. Economically, the Reichskommissariat Ukraine from 1941 to early 1944 paid the German government approximately 1.25 billion Reichsmarks, the German currency at the time, and 108 million Soviet-era rubles, equivalent to a total of about 5 billion euros as of 2021, or for my American speakers, $6.1 billion. This was done through a currency that the Germans created for the region and pegged onto the Reichsmark called Karbovanes. At 10 Karbovanes equals 1 Reichsmark. Rosenberg wished to implement an agrarian push in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, replacing state-owned Soviet properties with German ones and establishing Gemeinwirtschaften, or German communal farms, to produce food for the Wehrmacht and German citizens. They also established Kombines, state-funded monopolies made with the intent to exploit the resources of the Reichskommissariat. By 1943, Reichskommissar Koch recruited over 710,000 Ukrainians to be sent to do forced labor in Germany, but this backfired when the Germans needed extra manpower during the Battle of Kursk that had either been sent to Germany already or joined resistance groups in Ukraine. The SS, after pressure from both German officials and Ukrainian collaborators, created a Ukrainian military police called the Ukrainian Hilfspolizei, which worked with the SS garrisons to subdue resistance and enforce what little order remained, especially in the cities. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe, so it only makes sense that Berlin wanted to, apart from the whole Lebensraum thing, get that bread. Ukraine has massive potential to be an agricultural powerhouse, so by controlling the region, the Germans could theoretically produce enough food to supply the entirety of the Wehrmacht and still have quite a bit left over for the general German population. Reichskommissariat Ukraine also gave Berlin access to the Black Sea, meaning they had much easier access to the Mediterranean Sea and the ability to pressure Turkey, a very strategic region, to align closer to Berlin, hopefully either allowing the Kriegsmarine to use the Bosphorus Strait or for Turkey to join the war outright on the side of the Axis. For our last formalized Reichskommissariat, we are heading back to the Benelux. By mid-1944, it was becoming exceptionally clear that the Axis were going to lose the war. But, however, that was not enough to stop Hitler from continuing to do Hitler shit. Similar to the Reichskommissariat Niederlande, Hitler hoped to incorporate the rest of the Benelux into Germany proper. Luxembourg was annexed shortly after occupation when Fall Gelb was initiated in mid-1940, and the Netherlands was made into Reichskommissariat Niederlande. That leaves Belgium. Being in a very strategic position directly along France's northern border, Hitler would have many advantages if it was to permanently be in his grasp. The vast majority of the nation was put under a military administration, with the exception of the mostly German-populated Alpen-Malmedy, which was directly annexed into the Reich. This military-controlled region also included Nord-Pas-de-Calais, the region of France that borders Belgium. Shut up. This was a region that was historically Flemish, and Hitler wished to populate the area with Germanic Flemish people from northern Belgium. Reichskommissariat Belgien Nord-Frankreich was established on July 13th, 1944, and Hitler appointed Gauleiter Josef Groch as Reichskommissar 5 days later. This was the shortest-lived Reichskommissariat at only 5 months, 2 days. It was formally dissolved on December 15th, 1944. Due to the short existence of Reichskommissariat Belgien Nord-Frankreich, there is very little information I could find for this one. Grohe assumed leadership of the Volkssturm in Gau-Cologne-Aachen in September. He abandoned his post on March 6 and fled across the Rhine before the advancing American divisions in the area could get to him. He dissolved his Gau administration in April and went into hiding. He stayed in the Ore Mountains in the northern Sudetenland until the war ended. Afterwards, he fled to western Germany. Grohe attempted to commit suicide soon after the end of the war, but his attempt was unsuccessful. Upon recovering, he would work on a farm with a fake name until being discovered by the British occupation government on August 22nd, 1946, who promptly sent him to Belgium in May 1947. The Belgian government, however, returned him to West Germany in September 1949 without any prior prosecution or conviction. A German court tried him in September of 1950 for being within the Nazi leadership and gave him 4.5 years in prison with time served. He would join forces with the Naumann Circle and would remain loyal to Nazism until his death on December 27th, 1987. There isn't really a whole lot that I can put in Belgien Nord-Frankreich's How Was It Run section, since there isn't a whole lot about it out there. What I can mention, however, is that it was originally created for one specific purpose, to prepare the region for complete annexation into Germany. With Reichskommissariat Belgien Nord-Frankreich being the majority of Belgium and a sliver of northern France, had the war gone in favor of the Axis, it would have meant that the German territory would have extended through practically the entirety of the Ardennes Forest, so any defense against yet another German assault on France, if one were to happen post-war, would have been extremely difficult to prepare for, since both the Ardennes and the Maginot Line, Hitler annexed Alsace-Lorraine shortly after France fell, would no longer be accessible to the French or their allies. It would also lengthen the German reach along the English Channel and make it much easier for the Luftwaffe to bomb both French and British factories, airfields, ports, and cities. So, that brings us to the end of the formalized Reichskommissariats. But we are not done yet with the video as a whole. Don't worry though, James. We are almost finished. On top of the many fully established Reichskommissariats, Hitler also wished for a few extra Reichskommissariats in the USSR. Unfortunately for him, however, these Reichskommissariats were either never fully established or never attempted at all. I won't make fully segments for each of these, so they will all be fairly short. The Germans wanted the Soviet territorial limits and their sphere of influence out of continental Europe altogether, with Hitler describing the USSR as an Asiatic state. As a result, plans were drawn up for a primarily Russian Reichskommissariat named Reichskommissariat Moscovian. It would stretch from the borders of Reichskommissariats Ostland and Ukraine all the way to the Ural Mountains, excluding the Kola Peninsula in the north and the Caucasus Mountains in the south. SA Obergruppenführer Siegfried Kasch was designated as the Reichskommissar of the region once it was fully established. The capital was originally intended to be Moscow, but this was rejected by Hitler, who wished for the city and its 4 million residents to be killed and the area turned into an artificial lake. The Reichskommissariat Moscovian was only partially established, as only the western lands were occupied and only a few important cities were captured, with the primary areas like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kazan remaining unoccupied throughout the war. Kasch would flee to Croatia and then be kicked out in 1944. He was captured by the Allies and sent back to the newly reformed Yugoslavia, where he was tried and executed in 1947. After the failed Battle of Moscow in December 1941 and the subsequent end of Barbarossa, Hitler then chose to attack into the southern Caucasus Mountains and gain control of the vast supply of oil fields in the region. Back in Berlin, the idea of Reichskommissariat Caucasian was created. It would encompass the southern portions of European Russia, as well as the Transcarpathian SSRs of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, with the capital designated as Tiflis, today known as Tbilisi, capital of the Georgian SSR. Arno Shikadans was set to be the Reichskommissar, but Rosenberg proposed that his title be changed to Resident General, as he saw Reichskommissar to be too drastic. Don't ask me how that makes any sense. As with Moscovian, Reichskommissariat Caucasian was never fully established, mostly for the same reasons, as none of the primary cities like Tbilisi, Baku, Yerevan, or Stalingrad were captured. Shikadans was made chief of staff to Josef Terboven in the Reichskommissariat Norwegen in 1943 until 1944. He committed suicide in Berlin on April 12, 1945, after shooting both his wife and young daughter before turning the gun on himself. Rosenberg took notice of the anti-Russian stance in the Central Asian SSRs, so he created the idea to take advantage of it and came up with the concept of Reichskommissariat Turkestan. This Reichskommissariat was never given a proposed leader or capital, and the idea was shelved fairly soon after its conception due to Hitler not wishing to stretch beyond the Urals, and asked for Rosenberg to prioritize the occupation in Eastern Europe rather than Central Asia. The Reichskommissariat was never established for that reason, as well as the fact that the front line never even reached the proposed borders, meaning that no proposed piece of Reichskommissariat Turkestan came under Nazi occupation during the war. Well, there you have it. Some brief learnings of the Reichskommissariats. I hope that you all enjoy this video that I procrastinated a bit too much on. Mubby. All of the research, script writing, and video editing was done by myself, so while it is definitely not as good as a professional video would normally be, I try my best to make it work. If you have any other video ideas for me, whether they are history-related, gaming videos, or maybe a Nightmarecast topic, for those of you who know what that is, that you would like me to bring up with the guys sometime, feel free to let me know in the comments. Don't hesitate to like the video, as well as subscribe to both my channel and the Nightmarecast channel, where my friends and I periodically dick around and risk getting cancelled every 5 minutes. I don't really have much else to say other than that, so I guess just thank you all for watching.